Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. It is 8. Okay, it's 8 minutes after 4 in Pretoria and Bulawayo, in the afternoon, that is. And Wendy, Lynn, and I would like to welcome you all to what amounts to the second webinar from the stakeholder unit. We gave one before everyone went to Gainesville, and now this can be seen as a follow-up, and I think the timing is actually good. Sometimes you need to be forced into these things to recognize the opportunities. So what Wendy, Lynn, and I are going to try and accomplish with this particular webinar today, we've got 3 main objectives, and first of all is to review the stakeholder unit's role and the rationale for us being here and doing what we're doing. The second is going to be to clarify roles now going into phase 2. We are in phase 2 now, so it's no longer necessarily that transition phase. Now it's more, we're here, what are we all going to be able to do? And we're talking about the different elements within AgMIP, so the regional research teams, the ARPs, and leadership. Everyone has roles to play, and it's high time we had a pretty candid discussion about what those roles are going forward. Hi, Sabina. And then the third objective is to make sure that the stakeholder unit and ARPs and regional research teams can contribute ideas for planning for the June meeting. We've got Joska representing the Wageningen contingent, Sander and all, to make sure that we don't forget everyone's contribution to the Impact Explorer as well. So we'll talk through those 3 main objectives in the next hour. We're not going to do as much talking as you might think. We'll see how easy it is to manage a conversation and a dialogue in this format, because that's what we really want to do today. Wendy, Lynn, and I talk to each other enough, and it'd be nice if we can hear from everybody else and some feedback and input. Sherry, we'll try and manage this as easily as we can with you muting and unmuting. All right. Wendy, Lynn, I'm going to go on to the next slide and start with what we thought is a question fundamental to the way Wendy, Lynn, and I each approach this whole stakeholder unit and this idea of engagement. One of the really fundamental questions that we all need to answer is, whose learning counts? Now, trained where we were and read some of the development literature from probably the 90s, this question is going to be familiar. And it's important that each of us, depending upon our position and our roles and responsibilities, can ask and answer this question. This is meant to be provocative in some ways, because what we're trying to do is shift what appears to date to have been the vast majority of learning having been done by AgMIP team members. Okay, so certainly the leadership, the different teams based at Columbia, at Oregon State, at UF, and then all of the ARPs and the regional research teams. Our view of this is that it's time now that a lot of the learning about how to make research useful in development processes and planning processes, particularly around climate change, how do we make that more useful and relevant to ongoing processes and decision makers who are out there right now in need of this information? So we're actually trying to facilitate a process now where more learning takes place farther from the center. So we're actually trying to make sure that the regional research teams, their newly embedded stakeholder liaisons, and then their ARPs within those groupings actually do more and more of the learning with the stakeholders, next users, and end users out there on the ground. I hope that makes sense to everybody. I think it's a question, Sabina, I know you guys focus on this a lot. I would think Sander and Joska, you guys do as well. So we're going to keep asking the question about whose learning counts. We want to start now by reviewing quite quickly our roles now for our engagement in this process and project at all. We see the primary role, and there are some others that will come up later, but our primary role as it looks now, and this is evolving. This will not stay static. If it does through the length of the rest of the project, then we probably haven't done very well. Our learning in this case is going to change our role, but currently we see it as facilitating processes of engagement across the RRTs to help get AgMIP outputs into the hands and processes of those who can use them, right? So it's making the work that's been done useful in the real world now because decisions are being made that can use this. The rationale behind it is simply that the AgMIP outputs aren't going to get themselves into these processes. Scientists alone within the teams and across the teams cannot do it. They need help. They need engagement, they need support, and they need processes. Okay, Wendy Lynn? I said that we had a few more roles that we would get to, and these are slightly changed from the Gainesville meeting, but in essence, we see these as being essentially what we're here to do. So support modelers, scientists, regional research teams to orient their work towards specific outcomes of interest to users. So it's that bridging role, it's that facilitation role, it's some of the modification role probably. We take very seriously the role of linking regional research teams with opportunities. Those of you who were on the call yesterday heard Cynthia mention a few introductions and conversations that she had had. These are opportunities for different regional research teams to link up with other stakeholders, and we'll capture those and see how to facilitate those. It's important that we provide a platform for coaching and mutual learning. Okay? This goes to our point of whose learning counts, and as we get farther and farther away from the center, farther out to the research, the regional teams, how can we make sure that they share and learn from each other's experiences? Those lessons learned are going to be critical to getting everybody to do this better as time goes on. And we've also promised to document the successes and challenges. Another point made in yesterday's call by Cynthia and Ken, among others, people are really interested in investing in further AgMIP work. People are looking for opportunities to bring in new money to fund new avenues, new aspects, new lines of inquiry. What we're going through right now will be critical to targeting that future research, to informing who can use it and how. And that will all come only out of documentation and reflection on the successes and the challenges that that we go through now as a group. Okay, just a quick reminder of the principles that the stakeholder unit, and for some of you, you won't have seen or heard these before, so I'm trying to get that middle, sort of the middle ground. Those of you who've heard this, I don't want to bore you. Those of you who haven't heard this, I don't want to give it short shift. These principles seem fairly lofty, but there are very good reasons that we've settled on these 5. We're building a foundation with this work and with these teams. We're trying to make sure that what's done now serves as the starting point for the next proposals, for research that's built and designed to meet real needs in the future. We want everybody involved to be able to do that. Engagement, engagement, engagement. You can't expect people to buy into your approach, your models, your science, your outputs until and unless they trust you. That trust is built over time and over engagements, over meetings, over conversations, over goodwill. These relationships are very, very sensitive, and so this idea of ongoing engagement developing into trust over time is critical. That leads very well into partnerships. None of us can get to the outcomes we envision by ourselves. Everybody needs partners to get farther down the line and farther along the pathways of putting AgMIP information and outputs into decision-making processes. We're quite keen on this idea of transparency. We'll get into this a bit later, but one size is not going to fit all in terms of how regional research teams actually go about implementing this engagement. We're not in a position to put in place protocols for stakeholder engagement. You can't ask teams based all over the world dealing with different information, dealing with different decision makers, different national, regional priorities to follow the same exact steps. That cannot happen here with the stakeholder unit. Rather, it's this idea of principles and transparency. Let's all make informed decisions and have conversations about the best way forward in the context. That can best be accomplished. People need to be able to be honest and have discussions about how best to make decisions. And then, of course, inclusivity. We don't want to leave out anybody's opinion. Everybody's opinion does matter in these decisions and these processes. Okay. So after saying we're not going to talk much, I have, and that's going to be the end of my opening round in the presentation. Wendy Lynn will go on now into the timeline that you've developed. So Sherry, we need Wendy Lynn to be able to speak.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Amy. Considering that Amy and myself, are new to AgMIP, we just wanted to reflect on our time being part of the project, and call on everyone to think about how this is evolving and when it began. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, with our joining, we joined in October last year, and so by that time I think most of the folks on the project had already had an experience of phase 1 and had already had some initial engagement with stakeholders. And so the idea of bringing us on board was to make engagement a more systematic process, and to try to learn from these lessons. So we came on in October, and we visited with Cynthia and Alex and Carolyn and Sherry up in New York, and discussed some options for how we could build a stakeholder engagement unit in November last year. And one of the first things that we decided was important was to find out what the research teams and leadership teams had already learned, and what your visions were of what happened in the past and what could happen in the future. And so most of you, I think all of you, should have received the stakeholder engagement survey that we sent out in December, late November. And in the beginning of January, we provided some feedback from that survey, specifically feedback that would help us to think about developing work plans for phase 2. We still have quite a bit of data that we are yet to analyze, and that serves as a baseline for some of our work as we go forward. And we're very, very keen to share that information with everybody. So we're trying not to share it all at once. We're sharing it as it's relevant to building a process. So quickly, after that survey and in December, we developed some job descriptions for stakeholder liaisons, who were then asked to join each team. And we gave that role and responsibility of selecting the liaisons to, obviously, the research teams in country, because they're best positioned to know which of the people in their networks are best have the most capacity to be able to serve those functions of bridging, facilitation, and documenting successes and learning. And those folks came on board. In February, we had an introduction to the stakeholder liaisons, and bearing in mind that these webinars are all saved on the website. So I think it's important to try to use those as references as we go through this process, so that we can come back again and again to what are our principles, what was it that we set out to do in the beginning. And then many of you were in the Gainesville meeting, the global meeting in March, and that's where we really got an opportunity to meet face-to-face with the ARPs, face-to-face with the stakeholder liaisons, and frankly, I think that that's where we made some of the best progress so far, just in terms of connecting and understanding the different contexts that these SLs are working within. So we presented a poster on some of that survey, those survey results, and we'll make sure that that is on the website available for everyone to take a look at as well. And it was at that time that we started developing work plans with the stakeholder liaisons. And so we really see the stakeholder liaison as the critical element in this phase 2 process, but of course not working in isolation, but with a key link with the rest of their team. So the first part of that is actually distilling some of the findings from phase 1. And I know that in the Gainesville meeting, we sort of went back and forth of how that might happen. There was some options for looking at the handbooks, and we've made some progress. Sherry sent a technical report that has some information, but essentially each team is going to have to sit down and distill those findings together. It's not really going to be a process of handing off a couple of slides, because those findings then need to be articulated into different messages that could be relevant for different groups of stakeholders. So that's definitely a whole process in itself. And during the month of April and May, we're imagining that is, well, we're not imagining, we're actively working with RRTs to make sure that that's happening in each of the teams. But this is a very important place for the ARP, and so we'll come back a little bit to that as well. And then by May, at the end of May, the stakeholder liaisons have their first milestone, where they'll be sending in some reports on the initial lessons learned from phase 1 and the implications of those lessons for phase 2. And that'll put us in really good shape as we come together in June and have our regional meeting in Zimbabwe. So we're looking forward to having a couple of days of training and documentation and reflection alone with the SLs, and then really trying to use some of that 3-day meeting time to extend the lessons across teams, and even across teams and within teams among modelers and the different types of modelers that are engaged in the project. So that gives you a sense of where we're at, and I think I agree with Amy that it is opportune to have this webinar at this time, because it does push us to keep making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of where we're going. So I just wanted to point out that in terms of our approach, you know, we have talked about protocols and what that might mean for engagement and how we want to avoid providing a one-size-fits-all. We want to really use the approach of communities of practice, which is something that emerges from Etienne Wenger's work. I'm sure that Yosuke and some of you who study learning are keenly aware of their work, where they look at how exchange happens within core groups that are doing the same thing and having the same experiences, but being able to share those experiences such that learning emerges from the participation and the involvement of the people who are engaged in the same tasks. And so we want to create this community of practice primarily in the beginning for the stakeholder liaisons to be able to share lessons learned across their experiences across the different countries. But essentially, we want to have that whole group of learning, including the modelers and the leadership and the ARPs. And so extending that group of learning outwards so that we are able to create different kinds of research after the next 2 years as modelers and liaisons and ARPs think about interacting with local stakeholders in new ways. So we want to be really careful that the learning doesn't just get stuck in the stakeholder liaison group, or as sometimes happens, get stuck at the leadership level or get stuck in the RRT. We want to create these spaces for how we can allow lessons learned to be able to flow outward. And just remembering that not everything has to be learned by everyone and shared with everyone. So the most important thing is to be discerning about what needs to be shared so that we're not wasting everybody's time trying to get all people to learn all things across the group as related to engaging stakeholders. And this slide just shows that participation levels obviously change depending on people's roles in projects. And so you see the core group and the coordinator being actively participating. And as you go outward, you have different types of engagement. And, you know, we're expecting that not only within the AgMIP community, but also as we engage with other stakeholders. There are definitely going to be some interactions that are going to happen at a much more intense level, and others that are going to be opportunistic and happening at a different pace. But all of those ways of interacting need to be documented. So that's what we're going to be spending most of our time doing, documenting those different lessons learned in terms of how to engage within AgMIP and with non-scientist stakeholders. So I'm going to pass it over to Amy again as we go back into this idea of what are the ARPs doing within this new phase 2, and perhaps reflecting a little bit on what you did in phase 1 and how you see things differently in phase 2. So maybe I could start with a question to those of you who are on the call. Why do you think we're focusing on stakeholder engagement now in this way? And I'm not sure, Amy, if you wanted to articulate that question any differently.
One of the things that Wendy, Lynn, and I were wondering is, does everyone know why stakeholder engagement is on the agenda now? I mean, does everyone understand why this is an issue and why now? Does somebody want to unmute themselves and speak to that? Probably not Carolyn, not you, but someone else.
Just to let you guys know, I've unmuted you all. So if you want to speak, go ahead. But or if you don't, you can just control your muting yourself. There's, I think, a small enough group to, you know, people can control their own mics.
This is John. Yeah, I'll comment. You know, I think that's actually, I would like to restate the question first, because it has always been on the agenda. So I don't want us to start at this point with the perspective that until now it was not on the agenda. Um, you know, so I think now we are trying to, in a sense, take a somewhat different approach to stakeholder engagement, and certainly to, increase its um, sort of, you know, well, modify the approach in a sense. We're now developing the Impacts Explorer. We're now trying to, um, I think, you know, put the stakeholder engagement, much more in the hands of the regional teams, and try to, encourage them to really, play that role much more. But anyway, so I just want to make that point that, let's not, you know, um, say that, now it's on the agenda. Now it's, certainly kind of been heightened in priority in some sense, but it's always been on the agenda. And we did a lot of stakeholder engagement in phase one. I think that's an important point to make.
Someone else want to come in?
Well, so it's Carolyn, and although I was, oh, sorry, Jaska, go ahead.
Oh, okay, thanks. We were just waiting. Oh, well, I noticed in Europe last couple of years an increasing attention for impact. Every research project we write a proposal for, we try to submit for the European Commission. One of the main assessments is made on the quality of the impact with real performance indicators, and we have to describe them very in a detailed manner. So I've always assumed that this was a general trend going on, not doing research for an unspecified audience and goal, but already thinking when you start the research what type of impact you expect and you hope to get. So I'm not sure if this is an answer to your question, but that was what came to mind.
So, Carolyn here. So I think, yeah, I think that's, I mean, it has to do a little bit with some of the concepts that you were talking about previously, and the desire to have the methodology, spill over into new communities, enabling other people to understand how it is that you bring stakeholder interests into the problem space, so that you can actually assess possible, what it would mean to look at a set of possible decisions, not just in the current view, but looking a few steps forward. Taking into consideration physical, biological, and then with the methodology also technological things that are evolving. So I think there's a desire to have things that spill over into larger use in the community, and a knowledge also that that's not easy. And I think that's why maybe we're getting twisted a little bit on the words when we ask about stakeholder protocols. But it's part of, let's not get stuck on that word protocol. What we're talking about is being able to capture learning and make it understandable by an increasingly, sort of an increasing concentric set of players or potential users, so that there's sort of appreciation for the methodology, interest in the uptake, and support, increasing support for the researchers that have learned some of these methods, maybe that started with AgMIP but can go on into influencing the ways that things move from this time forward. So I think we have a lot of the same motivations, and you know, we are kind of a learning by doing organization, and the increased emphasis on interaction with the stakeholder will improve, you know, sort of the natural step. I think maybe, you know, that's alluding a little bit to what John is. That was the intent all along. Now we're moving further down the path as to how it is we actually do that. And as Jaska is, you know, alluding, these people are also helping us set our ways that we can measure our progress. So I view it as sort of the evolution that we're trying to advance. But I do have a interest in that diagram that you had that looked like a number of bowls. I mean, clearly we're trying to spill over the contents of each of those bowls. It looks like it's pretty hard in that bowl-like structure to get the learning to flow back into the core. Is it just a picture issue, or do you have... This is the part of it that I think we also have to keep coming back to as we engage in the research process, is this two-way flow. So I'd like to actually see in that diagram, instead of considering things like, you know, peripheral, or, I mean, it's fine that people are occasional peripheral, transactional or whatever, but who are they? Where are the ministries in that? Where's the person who's selling fertilizer? Where are the differences? And how can we make that diagram more meaningful for our community? Those are the kinds of things that I think we're hoping that we can advance in this area, so that the way that we work with the community who hold the decisions is more visible and more understandable, even if you miss the conversation. Okay, that's my long-winded comment.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. That's a really interesting point. We aim to address ask and pursue this, and the ARPs. Who are the ARPs on the call? I see Caleb, Guillermo, some others. Caleb, given what, I'll put you on the spot, given what we're talking about now and Carolyn's point about how do you make sure that we break down those bowls essentially, or those boundaries between groups. Caleb, what do you think of your role in this now? How do you see your role as an ARP, trying to link, trying to bridge? Can you tell us a little bit about that now?
Well, I think part of it would be to make sure that the team is thinking critically about stakeholder engagement. So, you know, when we have this, for example, with East Africa, putting together the plan with a multi-platform approach, we're really thinking it through and not sort of just following a rubric of, well, we're going to do this, this, and this, but thinking, okay, you know, what are our goals with stakeholder engagement? Who are we trying to reach? And what are the avenues that we can really reach them? And then, of course, sticking to it. And I think using kind of, as much as possible, continual feedback to see, or to try and assess the progress of this stakeholder engagement.
Caleb, while I've got you on the hot seat, Can you help start the discussion now about some of the linkages that you see between phase 1 and phase 2?
So do you mean linkages in the overall project, or linkages in the stakeholder engagement component?
I mean the latter. I mean, how are you going to approach this idea, the implications from phase 1? Okay, what you and your team know now, how is that going to shape what you do in phase 2? You said that you're being very purposeful now in this engagement and doing it for solid reasons. What role does the phase 1 work have on that? Or what impact does your phase 1 results have now going into phase 2?
Well, I think it can shed light on potentially what has worked in the region, what hasn't worked in the region, and at the very least it could potentially provide information in those ways.
Okay. Carolyn just had a good suggestion as well, Caleb, that I'm going to ask Guillermo, or Guy.
I am here. Well, I have a problem, okay? And I guess it's the same problem for all the ARPs. We were selected because we knew something about climate, crops, economy, basically phase 1. Okay, so we support our teams in modeling, in exchanging information, data transformation, etc. Blah blah blah. Stakeholders, we engaged as some stakeholders, as John mentioned, but it was not the, let's say, most important thing to do in phase 1. Okay, so all the ARPs were selected based on climate, crop, and economics, and I made this comment in my report because now, for instance, I have no idea, absolutely no idea about stakeholder engagement. Okay, so basically I'm trusting in both of you. Okay, number 1, and number 2, in the extension person or I don't know, a stakeholder engager in the region for the IGB. Beyond that, I need to learn. That's why I was asking in my report to Caroline and to Alex the possibility of having a special course or training or something like that for the ARPs. I think I am not only in this one. I am not only ARP without experience in the stakeholder engagement. So I don't know if you have comments about that.
Sure. I can weigh in on it. Wendy Lynn, you can. Anybody else on the call at this point can talk about how best to support you in working with the team in the region. Essentially, and this is why the ARPs were the target of this call, in addition to adding a new set of not quite tasks to your work, but the ARPs now are going to have to play that interpretation role. And that's why we asked, and Wendy Lynn, if you go to the next slide, we were asking about implications of phase 1 on phase 2. Because at this point, phase 1 results are your best starting point for engagement with stakeholders. Guillermo, the ARPs are not supposed to carry this load alone, right? The stakeholder liaisons are embedded in these teams, representing these regions and the context, so they can work with you and your teams and try and make the technical information more, first of all, understandable. Second of all, do a bit of matchmaking. Understand the lay of the land in terms of decision making in that region right now. Who is talking about climate change? Who is making policy? Who are planning investments? Who could really, really use the information that your teams are developing and generating? So back to that idea of the circles. Right now, the ARPs linked to each of the regional research teams. In addition, you are technical experts, and we're not going to turn everyone into context experts overnight, but now your roles probably, it's almost a support role, so that when very specific questions start coming in, you can help your regional research teams answer those in context. Yes, Minister, we can answer that question. Or no, we can't. The way things are currently, we need data, we need to change the model, whatever it is. So ARPs are going to play a critical role in distilling phase one information, and hopefully then being able to build on those phase one results into the phase two work plans. The idea being, we said this iterative engagement process. We don't envision this as a once-off, right? We envision this as building relationships in the regions with organizations, institutions, structures, processes who are really going to buy into AgMIP outputs and use them in decision making going forward. So we do see a link to phase one and phase two in that regard, and just we may be the only ones that see that link, Guillermo, and if so, that's something that we need to know.
No, that's perfect. This is what I wanted to hear. After your answer, I have a more focused idea of what will be the ARP's engagement task. So it's not only like guiding or sometimes doing the job for the IGP, but also is, as you mentioned, the key word, I guess, is translation. You know, translating one thing to the other one and transmitting the information to the stakeholders per se. Okay, I have something to think about. Thanks a lot for the answer.
That was an answer. I'm sure it wasn't the answer.
I have a question again. I understand the point about making sure that we understand what is possible to learn from phase one to apply as we go into phase two. But I also feel like the work that we do in phase two needs to be motivated by things that we've discovered along the way that are different from what we did in phase one. So, for example, there are communities of stakeholders that we never approached that are probably more likely to be or could be the target, but we don't know them yet. And you know, also there are stakeholders that we may have engaged with that were very effective for helping us in terms of learning a certain set of you know, of things, and having done that, we can now see that the likelihood of enacting a decision that has a big impact on the ground that can be taken to scale is very limited in terms of the, that interaction with that stakeholder. That the thing that we can do best with them is sort of like this information exchange and awareness building, and that's a very valuable contribution. I think we're waking up, I mean there's just a range of interactions that we can have that differ by the class of stakeholder that you're interacting with, and that we need to evolve our understanding of how best to inform the research question. What are the real decisions that we actually want to affect? Where is the greatest, for lack of better language, bang for the buck in terms of trying to bring decisions to scale? How do we actually sort of wander about in the field of potential stakeholders to find the ones that we need to work with to affect our decisions and demonstrate the promise of the methodology? We're looking to the stakeholder unit to help us, because we can't just take what we learned from phase one. We learned some things that tell us that we might need to look, under a different lamppost, for example. We may, so I wonder what you have to say to that.
Well, maybe I could just comment on a few things. I think that what we really need to do and what we're trying to motivate is this space for reflecting, not simply putting down some lessons learned on a slide and then each team going ahead and doing what they've learned, but actually having these kind of critical questions go across teams. What is the greatest bang for your buck? What does that really mean? When you talked about that, Carolyn, you said, being able to take decisions to scale. And that's definitely one way to think about the biggest bang for your buck. But what we're also interested in is having these modeling and engagement teams learning together how to make research more relevant. And so I think the question for each of these RRTs is how to use your time over the next 2 years and how to really intentionally plan engagements that are iterative based on perhaps some of those really strong stakeholder relationships that you have from phase one. And then how to, in other moments, be opportunistic and go and look under a different lamppost. I think we have to also be really realistic and not too ambitious about the many stakeholders that we can engage in each of these places, and rather try to engage some really deeply and learn from that process, such that when we get to phase 3 of AgMIP, we'll be able to have a much more intentional process. I think that we have to just be careful of not trying to engage too many different groups at too many different scales, such that we can show on paper that we've taken things to scale, but actually after the project ends, those relationships dissolve. So I think the question is, after these next 2 years, what do we want to have in place that we could work on for the next phase? I think that's something to think about as well. And just in terms of Guillermo's understanding of the role being translation and transmission, that's it. That's how I see the ARP's role here. And I think that the SL, the Stakeholder Liaison, and the ARP are going to have very intimate interactions. And I'm wondering, considering distance and considering all of these other challenges, how can we set that up and how can we enable that? Because part of what we're talking about is people's time. And so if we want to have iteration, in an ideal situation, we would have Guillermo with the RRT going through 3 different workshops, one as an initial workshop, one as a progress workshop, and one as an evaluation workshop with his team, with the stakeholders. And so the question is, how feasible will that be able to be? And I think we need to think more on sort of this timeline process as well, being able to think about how the ARP can go to the region, use their expertise in their specific discipline like climate or crops, but then be available and maybe tag those meetings on or those trainings on to engagement meetings, such that they can be able to be in these different spaces. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone on the call.
I don't want to overspeak, so I'll just respond briefly. I think the idea of having a timeline of activity for phase 2 is fabulous. I think you're right. We don't know, are we swimming in a 10-foot pond or a 1,000-foot? And we can't go all the way. I agree with all of those comments. So I think we're really looking to you and Amy, Wendy, Lynn, to help us gauge the right level of activity across the time that we have that sets us up for measurable progress. What is that? How do we define it? And phase 3. Those are all quite good. And yes, I think this idea of the translation and transmission role for the ARPs is spot on. So that's, I think, a really helpful concept as well. So thanks for those clarifications.
Okay, we're almost at the hour, and I don't want to go over very much. Thanks, Wendy Lynn. We haven't spent a lot of time on these and the questions in the next slide, particularly in the lead up to the June meeting. Guillermo and Caleb, are you available outside of this forum for conversations? Let's work with you to figure out what questions do you most need answered by the time we all get together in June, and how can we best use that time?
Yes, I'm available, and I think that'd be very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, me too, and I need it.
Okay, just to take a little bit of the pressure off, or I'm not sure it's real pressure, but I get the sense that there's some pressure that people are feeling. The reason behind embedding a stakeholder liaison from the region within each regional research team is for them to be able to do a lot of the heavy lifting in this regard. So the translation and transmission is going to be in response to opportunities and needs that are identified there within the regional teams by the liaison in consultation with the team. So you guys aren't going to be in a position of going out and marketing things to people that you don't know. We're not ever in the business of putting you guys in situations like that are uncomfortable and unnecessary. Also knowing that each regional research team is embedded differently within the region, within institutions and organizations and structures there. So what we're working on now with the stakeholder liaisons is for them to actually be understanding that context and be able to communicate it well enough to ARPs, to each other, and to leadership, so that everybody gets a better idea of where each of the teams is starting. So you're not going to be thrown in the deep end as ARPs necessarily, but I can see you being brought in for very specific conversations and support roles. Wendy Lynn, I'm not sure if you've got something that you want to add to that, but that's what we should work toward for the June meeting agenda, I think.
Yes, I just wanted to also recognize that we're very much focused, as you probably noted, on the process of how we learn together and how we engage with stakeholders. But we do also have two valuable members of the team who are Yaski and Sander, who are going to create, outputs and products, which are the Impact Explorer. And so we really need to create the opportunities for that translation to happen in that realm. And that's also where I see the ARPs as having some really great technical expertise. And many of you have worked with other teams that already have these types of tools. And so I think that you're helping teams and stakeholder liaisons sort of envision the types of tools or outputs that the Impact Explorer could have will be very helpful as well. And definitely in June, we'd like to spend some time doing that through perhaps a demonstration that we would do with the Zimbabwe team. Perhaps not doing the demonstration in front of the whole AgMIP community, because that would be really intimidating for stakeholders, but perhaps reflecting on an experience that they have in May, and then reflecting on that as a whole group and sharing ideas of how that worked and what are the potential outputs in terms of Impact Explorer tools. So I'm seeing sort of June as a really critical moment for us to actually get some first lessons learned happening. And I was wondering if Joske and Sander have any thoughts or additions that they'd like to add.
Hello, Sander here. I don't know about thoughtful, we can try. I think it's, this is a process, so I fully support Guillermo's point that we should learn, and it's community learning. And we know, we have experienced how we can do these things and what is required to bring that in something like an Impact Explorer, but also more generally how to do the messaging on these type of topics. And I think that's a challenge for everybody in this domain to really think clearly, what's the main message we want to bring to stakeholders and how are we going to format the message into the context of the stakeholder. And yeah, so that's it's a bit learning by doing, I think, and maybe it's a good question to have in the back of our minds, how much should we all know about this and how much do we delegate to specific persons to just do the job and get on with it. And we are looking forward in June to really start building this sort of first storylines that we can use for the messaging and trying to bridge the gap, I think, from the model outputs, whatever they may be, towards the final messages that a stakeholder that will really trigger a stakeholder. And this is also a challenge for science in the sense that with the climate change, a lot of people, it's a far away discussion, so it's not really triggering them. So we really need to think on how and what our results are telling us that is really urgent for a stakeholder to act on today, not wait 20 years, I can say.
Okay. Thanks, Sander. I think that gives us some more to work with as we get into the detailed for the May engagement with the team in Zimbabwe and then the June engagement at the meeting in Victoria Falls.
Amy, I just wanted to say one quick thing.
Any other thoughts, comments?
I just wanted to say,
yeah, sure.
I think at this point, we also have to kind of trust each other to do the right thing. I think we're setting up processes for reflection. We're setting up ways that we can engage with ARPs, ASLs, RRTs, leadership to kind of verify if we're on the same page. And I think that's really important to keep making sure that we're moving sort of towards the same direction so that when we talk about stakeholder engagement, 80% of people understand it in a similar way. And I think that's the direction we're moving towards. But I think we also have to understand that there are going to be nuances, there are going to be differences, and that's where the learning is going to happen, is as we explore those differences, as we together reflect on those nuances, that's where we're really going to build the outcomes for this project that are going to go on to enable research to be more action-oriented. And so we're not there yet, and so what we need to do is continually create these spaces for being able to get there. So I have a lot of faith in the stakeholder liaisons. After meeting with them, I feel like we're in good shape, and so I'm really looking forward to working closely with them, especially in the sort of build up to the June meeting. So I would just encourage ARPs to work closely with their stakeholder liaison, and I feel like another thing we need to sort of talk about is how we communicate with you all going forward, because my concern is that a lot of our conversations and a lot of our learning is happening at sort of a scale where it's the same folks that are coming to the same meetings and talking about these things. And so I really want to make sure that we reach those people who aren't able to be here. And I look forward to hearing from Guillermo and Caleb about how we can reach the other ARPs. What's the best way to engage with you folks? And maybe it's on individual emails, but we need to figure that out early on, and then how to share that across different RRTs. And I would really hope that and I know that in the future webinars we're going to have a wider participation of the regional country teams, because I think these are the conversations that we all need to be having together. So I don't want to take up any more of your time. I think we've taken up a lot of time, and I hope that this has been valuable. We haven't really heard from Swati or Sabine, but how are you feeling about the Zimbabwe meeting?
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sabina's gone. She had problems with her phone, so she's not around. I think she and I talked a little bit about what we're going to be doing in May. I think it's the 5th and 6th of May, and then also what kinds of what differences would be between May and June. I think I got a bit confused when she was talking. It sounded like we were doing the same thing in May and again with the same set of people in June. So we're going to try to figure out what the differences are between the two times that we engage with the stakeholders here. I know she said to me that she feels it's a great opportunity for us to have all of you around while we interact with the stakeholders in June. So we just need to think through a clear process of how we work with them and what we're really trying to help them do better. I think she's got Thursday with someone to start that conversation a little bit. So we're trying to figure it out at this point.
Thank you. Great. I think we have a conversation scheduled for Friday to talk about the May meeting, and we're hoping that that will then be shared on our community of practice with the other RRTs to give an example of what's happening, and then others will start sharing their examples too. So we'll definitely include you in those discussions, or at least in the outputs of those discussions. And Amy, do you have any final thoughts, or does anyone have any final thoughts or questions that you'd like to close with?
Everyone is
I'd
quiet.
just like to say thank you. Well, I'd just like to say thank you. This has been very helpful, and we didn't have a lot of advance notice. That's part of the reason that some of the other ARPs are not on. And then there's always the fact that we have a very, there's a lot of people who want the time of our ARPs, so they actually travel a lot and have a lot of other things that they're working on too. So I'm very confident that you guys are going to be able to find your windows of opportunity to exchange. Don't forget to bring along, some of us in the coordination from time to time as well, so that we can speak of your wonderful work. Anyway, thanks very much for putting this together. I think it was very helpful, and thanks also to Shari for all of the going back and forth to figure out the best platform, and so that we can record it and make it possible for others to hear as well.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Amy and Wendy Lynn.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you there. Bye-bye. Hopefully others will be able to hear this later.
Good job. Yeah,
Okay.
I have some comments that I'll make them later, Wendy Lynn.
Sounds
Bye.
great. Thank you.
Bye, all.
Next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.